here, Global Affairs Unfiltered. The 30th day, last day of June, 2025. You're listening to Jack Stockwell and simulcasting at K-Talk. We worked on the audio stuff over the weekend, and I think maybe we might have some of the better sound than we've had in a while. Trying to find something to talk about this morning. It's been such a dull week. Unfortunately, my assessment is that the world is still in a horrible mess, even if the situation with Iran and Israel has calmed down somewhat. That cannot be said for the horrible affairs that are going on in the Gaza. But more at large, I think we're not at all in the area where anything is going to be ended at all. So I want to go through the different elements that are involved with what I'm talking about. President Trump obviously concluded after the Israeli and then the U.S. attacks on the Iranian facilities that is now done and over. He was very proud of himself, if you've seen some of his self-congratulatory remarks, saying this was the greatest military operation in history ever. I kind of think about Alexander the Great. I think about President Eisenhower. I think about Sherman and Grant. And I don't know. I don't know if this was the greatest military operation in history. Probably the highest tech one ever. But he claims that all the Iranian facilities have been destroyed. And now that's a big question mark, given the fact that it is very likely that the Iranians foresaw what was going to happen. And in fact, there is some information out there that perhaps they were warned ahead of time. And they've transported much of their enriched uranium, the centrifuges, the cascades, the other elements of the facilities to different locations, somewhere deep in the mountains. Maybe some damage was done, but it wasn't eliminated at all, which is why we still have to be somewhat on alert here, because there are some forces, including the United States, who would like nothing better than for this to renew against Iran, and this time maybe even better equipment and maybe better targeting, let alone the fact that they took out several scientists and engineers. Now, a lot of damage has been done, and I want to go through the different elements here. One, for example, is that the International Atomic Energy Agency has lost all credibility. I mean, this is devastating, because if you don't have an agency, then the whole non-proliferation treaty goes out the window. Because, I mean, who would verify the adherence to the agreements in the nuclear field at all? I mean, it's terrible. And I think it does require a real international independent investigation as to what exactly happened, as former British diplomat Alistair Cruz, who I enjoy listening to every Monday, or I try to, was saying several days ago that there was a report on June 11 from a program that Palantir, of course, you know, the AI firm in the United States, which has all kinds of military agreements with Israel and other states, that according to their software mosaic, there were signs that Iran had enriched in the uranium and was actually preparing in the direction of a nuclear weapon. And that basic assessment colored what the International Atomic Energy Agency had put out back on June 12. That was at least creating an environment, and I don't know if it caused the decision, but it certainly shaped the environment in which all of media and the politicians subsequently were claiming that Iran was very, very close, as they have for 2 decades now, to building a nuclear weapon. Then on June 17, Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, corrected that and said that that was not the case. But then it was too late, because the attack had already occurred. So as a consequence, Iran canceled their agreement with the International Atomic Agency, which is really very bad, because that creates a whole new dimension to this problem, because that puts into question what was the role of the military use of artificial intelligence in creating the environment for this attack to occur in the first place. You know, was it carelessness? I mean, was it deliberate maliciousness? Was it part of a manipulation of a greater scenario that still has to play? I mean, I think that requires an independent investigation, and I hope that the relative agencies and institutions will pick up on this question because I think that's very important. Now, I think the reputation of the International Atomic Energy Agency has to urgently be repaired. And I think that's an urgent question. There are some people who think that the only way to do that is for Grossi to resign. That also remains to be looked at carefully, but even more fundamentally, the damage which has been done to international law is the worst of all. I mean, it's one thing if Israel is attacking Iran. That's bad enough. But that was an unprovoked war of aggression. Then if President Trump, who was in negotiations with Iran, who made all signs that there would be a negotiated outcome, is then completely doing the opposite. He's participating in something which can only be characterized as an unprovoked war of aggression against Iran, a country who was doing us no harm whatsoever. And that's completely shattered international law. I mean, that's everybody on the planet can now say, well, if the United States can do that and get away with it, we can too. I think it's lowered the barrier for that kind of aggression in many different expressions from a lot of other countries who are constantly warring, but the warring has been left, at a few tank shots and mostly bullets. But a lot of these warring factions in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, have missiles. But even more importantly, and I think more dangerous, is the fact that it's now apparent to the whole world that the collective West operates under a double standard. I mean, if Russia takes something in Ukraine, which one can argue whether or not that was an unprovoked act of aggression, or if there's some long history before that. I mean, if that is an unprovoked aggression, then if Israel attacks Iran when Iran clearly has no intention to build a bomb, then that all of a sudden is clearly not unprovoked aggression. And it's apparent to the whole world that this double standard exists now. And when you have a double standard in respect to international law, then you have no international law. And I think that's where we are, and I think that's something that really has to be taken into serious matter. Now, one thing very clear is that there may have been an element, because it's very clear Trump did not want to be in that war, but he's now in that war. And that means his entire base has second thoughts about his truthfulness. And naturally, there are many neocons in the United States who would like nothing better than a return of that same operation. General Kurilla, the commander of CENTCOM, is known as being in favor of this kind of an attack against Iran for a long, long time now. And he'll leave, I think it's next month, he goes into retirement. And there are estimates that this may have been a factor in the timing on the side of the Israelis, knowing that they wanted to have the backing of that part of the U.S. military if they were ever to make such an attack. And I think it's clear that everybody is going to draw their own conclusions out of what's happened. Just Friday, I think it was, there was a very important meeting in Qingdao in the Shandong province of all the defense ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which means China, India, Iran, many other defense ministers were meeting. And obviously they're going to evaluate and make plans to prevent such a return from happening, a rerun, I mean. And naturally the other side knows that as well, so I think we're really in for a heightened alarm situation right now with absolutely no reason to let our defenses down. And an additional element to consider is the unfortunate remarks of Chancellor Merz in Germany, who commented on the Israeli attack on Iran by saying this remark at the G7 in Canada to a reporter. He said, "Yes, Israel is doing the dirty work for all of us." Now that remark has caused total international disgust. I mean, how can you call an unprovoked military attack which kills people, kills scientists, engineers, military people, causes enormous damage, could have the potential of leading to World War III, how can you call that the dirty work? I mean, that's the estimate of many sources in the global south, and I think it very clearly reveals a neo-colonial mindset on the part of Merz. He clearly believes according to the Indian commentator and former diplomat who was at these meetings that the mindset of the Crusaders, which is typical of the Europeans, who think all non-Christians in the world are some other species one has to try to reduce in numbers as much as possible. That's terrible. That's absolutely terrible. That's how you get international wars. And the Russians, Maria Zakharova, I've been calling Zakharova, I think it's Zakhovara. As I think I heard Lavrov pronounce it Zakhovara, have pointed to the unfortunate tradition that a leader in Germany could say such things more than 80 years after the Second World War is unbelievable, and it's being noted around the entire world. It's just horrible. I can only say that the people in Germany really should make sure this doesn't happen again. Now, I have to say, in honor of the comedian in Germany, this fellow Didi Hallervorden, that he is suing Merce for incitement of war. And sometimes the comedians seem to be the only truthful people these days, when the journalists are clearly not the source of truth. So we're in kind of an incredible situation where lawlessness is now the rule of the land. And therefore, I find it very important that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has brought up the question of the absolute urgency and priority of the principles of a new international security architecture. And this I can only fully appreciate and be happy about, because all the people who were participating in the International Peace Conference since the outbreak of the special military operation back in February of 2022, 3 years ago. Immediately afterwards, the Schiller Institute, Helga in particular, calling for this new security agreement. I think Lavrov is putting this forward, putting it forward now as the most important and urgent question of the day. And I can only fully agree that it needs to be adhered to in earnest, be put on the international agenda by the UN General Assembly, by the BRICS countries, by the other bodies of discussion, the think tanks, the universities, as we inch closer and closer to Armageddon. Now, I'm quite concerned about the idea that Trump is winning this, and that he now can rest, since he believes the nuclear facilities have been destroyed. And that will be becoming very quickly clear that that's not the case. And then the question is, what are you going to do next? Because as many of the pundits I've listened to over the last 3 or 4 days have said, that if Iran wasn't making a bomb, you can bet they're making a bomb now. And there's going to be an effort by the neocons, of course, on both sides of the Atlantic, because the neocons are unfortunately not only inside the United States, they have a good many number of them in Europe. And they're going to for sure want to go back and have a return to the present situation. I think if this isn't overcome, this neo-colonial mindset, I think is really the biggest task of the time, because it was the neocons who lied their heads off and took us to the Iraq War 20-some years ago. It was the neocons who convinced us that it was a bunch of Islamic jihadist crazies who blew up the buildings on 9/11, and so that took us into Afghanistan. And they haven't gone anywhere. They're still there. And there's as many of them in Europe as there is in our country. And that they're just sitting there chomping at the bit, waiting for the next round of whatever. Oh, here, I got to mute this. The next round of whatever to take place. Sorry, I'm supposed to be watching the signal here at the radio station. Sorry for talking over that. But in any case, the global majority is moving very fast in a completely different direction. And something I definitely want to keep my finger on the pulse of. So since just yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry announced yesterday that overnight, quote, the Russian armed forces delivered a mass strike by air, ground, and sea-based long-range precision weapons, Kinzhal hypersonic ballistic missiles, as well as unmanned aerial vehicles at Ukrainian defense industry plants and oil refineries. According to accounts, and I was waiting to hear some report of this on the morning news, I didn't hear a word. According to accounts in the Western media, this was the largest air attack of the war so far. And it coincided with further Russian advances on the land in the Donetsk region. Now, the Financial Times said this. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia has fired a staggering 537 aerial weapons in a single overnight barrage that began late on Saturday, including 477 explosive drones and decoys, 60 missiles of various types. Ukrainian air defenses intercepted 211 drones and 38 missiles. That has yet to be confirmed, as far as I'm concerned. Financial Times added that Ukraine's Air Force said one of its F-16 pilots, Lieutenant Colonel Maxim Ustimenko, was killed after his aircraft sustained damage while downing 7 aerial targets. So the Ukrainian F-16 pilots, are that good by now? Could be. So while the previous night's aerial bombardment had targeted drone factories in Kyiv and elsewhere, according to Russian and neutral online military analysts, the June 28-29 barrage hit many targets in western Ukraine. In addition, there was another barrage against the Kremenchuk oil refinery in Ukraine's central Poltava region, the country's last working refinery, which had been nationalized by the Zelensky government to produce fuel for military vehicles. And now its demolition obviously is going to hurt the armed forces of Ukraine logistics in the Donbass, where there are reports of a decisive Russian move towards the encirclement of the hub city of Pokrovsk. So further south in the Donetsk region, the Russian forces last week captured the area of large lithium deposits near the village of Shevchenko, according to Military Watch magazine and other media, and the field is one of the deposits eyed by the Trump administration's resource grab deal with Kyiv. So Financial Times reports on earlier comments by Ukrainian Defense Minister Umerov that Moscow's aim is to exhaust our air defense. You think? Acting President Zelensky reacted to the new massive Russian assault by pleading almost on his knees for more American weapons. He says Ukraine needs to strengthen its air defense, the thing that best protects lives. These are American systems, which we are ready to buy. Yeah, with the money we gave them. Sure, sure. Where's that money go? Doesn't go to the U.S., it goes to the military-industrial complex, who loves all these missiles being fired all over the place. So Iran has rejected the chief Grossi's request to resume the visits of nuclear sites that were bombed by the U.S. and Israel. I'm quoting here from the news release. The Parliament of Iran has voted for a halt to collaboration with the IAEA until the safety and security of our nuclear activities can be guaranteed, Agrachi said on X. This is a direct result of the regrettable role in obfuscating the fact that the agency a full decade ago already closed all past issues. The IAEA and its Director General are fully responsible for the sordid state of affairs, Agrachi said, Foreign Minister, of course, for Iran. Do you know how big Iran is? Do you know how big Ukraine, let me put it in perspective here. You know how big Ukraine is? The Ukraine's the biggest country there in Europe. And it's the size of Texas. Iran is the size of 4 Ukraines. Iran is huge. Iran is covered with missile sites and covered with mountains, with deep constructed missile-resistant facilities. And to think for 1 minute that a country, even though it is under a religious dictatorship, is still full of extremely intelligent, logistics-oriented in the sense of the military as well as nuclear development brainiacs. And to think that Fordow and taking out Fordow would be the end of nuclear development, as President Trump has asserted, is either an incredible state of naivety or stupidity. Yeah, I said it. Somebody had to say it. All right, a couple more things here before I get into some other stuff. Let me jump to this. Now, President Trump may have thought that his ceasefire on June 23 brought the war on Iran to an end. But his hysteria just on Saturday over a speech delivered on June 26 by Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, apparently is the correct pronunciation, betrays how volatile this situation and therefore how great the danger of warfare still is. Why, this is President Trump, why would the so-called Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei of the war-torn country of Iran say so blatantly and foolishly that he had won the war with Israel when he knows his statement is a lie? It is not so. Trump was very angry when he was saying that. He said his country was decimated. Now that's why I told you how big Iran is. Once again, Ukraine is as big as Texas. Iran is as big as 4 Ukraines. 4 Texases could fit in Iran. And yet Trump says Iran has been decimated. He says his 3 evil I voted for the man. I voted for the man because, in my opinion, he was better by far than the alternative. And I decided to go along with a lot of other people and give him his 100 days. Now, with what he's doing and what he is doing militarily, but what he is doing, and I'll get into more of this later in the program, pleading with the prosecutors in Israel to drop all charges against Netanyahu. I don't know. I tried to think of an analogy, some kind of a comparison to that. The only thing I could come up with is when they finally decided the only way they could bring down Capone, because they couldn't connect Capone with his money, but they could connect Capone with false IRS filings. Can you imagine President Herbert Hoover pleading with the prosecutor in the District Court of Chicago, Illinois, to drop all the charges against Alphonse Capone? Why? Because he's a good man. Quit persecuting him. So back to President Trump. He says his country was decimated, his 3 evil nuclear sites were obliterated, and I knew exactly where they were sheltered, and would not let Israel or the U.S. Armed Forces, by far the greatest and most powerful in the world, terminate his life. I saved him, meaning the Supreme Leader of Iran, from a very ugly and ignominious death. And he does not have to say, "Thank you, President Trump." In other words, Trump claims in a childish fit to have saved Khomeini's life. And therefore, Khomeini should act accordingly. He said, during the last few days, I was working on the possible removal of sanctions and other things, which would have given a much better chance to Iran at the full, fast, and complete recovery. The sanctions are biting. But no, instead I get hit with a statement of anger, hatred, and disgust, and immediately dropped all work on sanction relief and more. Mr. President, what are you, 12? What are you, 8, 6? It's not easy for me to talk about my president like this. Trump further promised that from here on out, things are only going to get worse for Iran unless Tehran properly genuflects and grovels. He said Iran has to get back into the world order flow or things will only get worse for them. They are always so angry, hostile, and unhappy, and look at what it's gotten them. A burned out, blown up country with no future, a decimated military, a horrible economy, and death all around them. They have no hope, and it will only get worse. And I wish the leadership of Iran would realize that you often get more with honey than you do with vinegar. What do you say to that? Indeed, Khomeini was totally defiant. He said, I feel it's necessary to extend several congratulations to the great Iranian nation. First, congratulations on the victory over the fake Zionist regime. Oh, he's picking up on Trump. Despite all its noise and claims, the Zionist regime was nearly brought to its knees and crushed under the blows of the Islamic Republic. You know, he's right. If Trump hadn't intervened, by now or a week from now, there would be no Israel because of the missile pummeling that Iran has been giving Israel. Israel is in far worse condition than the news is letting on. And because of the moratorium by the IDF against any news releases coming out of Israel showing the depth of their destruction, it'd be a different story. The Supreme Leader continues, we thank God for aiding our armed forces who managed to breach their advanced multi-layered defense systems and flatten large parts of their military and urban centers with powerful missiles and weapons strikes. Now, something to keep in mind, some of the strongest of the Iranian missiles haven't been launched yet. And that's why I titled this program today, the Iran-Israel war is going to continue. After this brief interruption, we will continue with the war. Khomeini said the U.S. entered the war directly because it feared that if it didn't, the Zionist regime would be completely destroyed. I believe him. I think that's the truth. I think that's exactly what would have happened. If it intervened to save them from gaining nothing from the war. Now, the Iranian Foreign Minister Aghachi called on President Trump, please treat Iran in a civilized manner. He says the complexity and the tenacity of Iranians is famously known in our magnificent carpets woven through countless hours of hard work and patience. But as a people, our basic premise is very simple and straightforward. We know our worth, we value our independence, and never allow anyone else to decide our destiny. Excuse me. He said if President Trump is genuine about wanting a deal, he should put aside the disrespectful and unacceptable tone towards Iran's Supreme Leader, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, and stop hurting his millions of heartfelt followers. The great and powerful, no, not Oz, the great and powerful Iranian people who showed the world that the Israeli regime had no choice but to run to daddy to avoid being flattened by our missiles, do not take kindly to threats and insults. If illusions lead to worse mistakes, Iran will not hesitate to unveil its real capabilities. which will certainly end any delusion about the power of Iran. Wow, what does that mean? Then he said, goodwill begets goodwill. Respect begets respect. Now, I have to read that again. I am moved by that statement. This is the foreign minister talking like, I was going to say talking like Trump, but better choice of verbiage. But this is when Marco Rubio goes out to other nations representing the president and the United States. He kind of speaks for the president and the United States. And what he says until Trump, hauls him back in and backtracks, it kind of stands as the will of the president. Here, the Iranian equivalent of Rubio, the great and powerful Iranian people who showed the world that the Israeli regime had no choice but to run to daddy to avoid being flattened by our missiles, do not take kindly to threats and insults. If illusions lead to worse mistakes, Iran will not hesitate to unveil its real capabilities. And what is that? So I think that is kind of the update that I wanted to go through here. Just zipping through my notes. Medvedev, I used to call him Medvedev. I hear the Russians call him Medvedev. Donald Trump twisted the content of a Telegram post by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, wrongly accusing him of considering the option of supplying Iran with nuclear weapons. That's been, with the big, huge aircraft tanker haulers before the attack showing up in Iran, in Tehran and other places with big haulers coming in from China and from Russia. The word on the street was, in fact, that Russia was delivering a nuke to Iran to be able to use against Israel. So Medvedev answered this. He said, regarding President Trump's concerns, I condemn the U.S. strike on Iran. It failed to achieve its objectives. However, Russia has no intention of supplying nuclear weapons to Iran because, unlike Israel, we are parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I know quite well that this would entail having overseen our nuclear forces as president myself, but other countries might, and that's what's being said. And we definitely should not be arguing over who has more nukes. All the more so because the New START Treaty, which I once signed with a U.S. president, is still in force for now. The question is, what comes next? So here's Medvedev's post on about a week ago, which is, what I have here is a translation from the original Russian. He said, what have Americans accomplished with their nighttime strikes on 3 nuclear sites in Iran? Number 1, critical infrastructure of the nuclear fuel cycle appears to have been unaffected and sustained only minor damage. 2, the enrichment of nuclear material, and now we can say it outright, the future production of nuclear weapons will continue. 3, a number of countries are ready to directly supply Iran with their own nuclear warheads. I suspect one of those is Pakistan. Israel is under attack. Explosions are rocking the country and people are panicking. The U.S. is now entangled in a new conflict with prospects of a ground operation looming on the horizon. See, this is why I go to these sources to try and figure out what's going on, because I'm not going to hear this on Fox, and I'm certainly not going to hear this on CNN. He says Iran's political regime has survived and in all likelihood has come out even stronger. The people are rallying around the country's spiritual leadership, including those who were previously indifferent or opposed to it. Donald Trump, once hailed as president of peace, has now pushed the U.S. into another war. Then the vast majority of countries around the world oppose the actions of Israel and the United States. That is definitely true. And then the last one. With such successes, Trump will not see the Nobel Peace Prize, even despite the venality of this nomination. Good start, Mr. President. Congratulations. From Dmitry Medvedev. Wow. All right. Now here, every now and then, something comes along the way to give you a very good idea of what's really happening, of what's happening, who's pulling the strings, where the power centers are, who controls whom. And so back on June 25th, a mere 5 days ago, Trump took it upon himself to order the Israeli nation to immediately cancel the multiple corruption trials against Prime Minister Bibi genocidal Netanyahu, whom he calls a great wartime prime minister, a warrior, like perhaps no other warrior in the history of Israel. You thought I was going to say in the world. Well, Trump is not going to call somebody else the greatest warrior in the world. So in an ignominious Wednesday evening Truth Social post, replete with capital letters and exclamation points, our president said this. Now, wait a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. Why is Netanyahu in judicial trouble? Why do pundits assert that the only thing that has kept him out of prison is the war? That he started this war in October of 23 in order to not have to appear in court, because under some kind of wartime conditions, he is outside the immediate justice of the Israeli court system. And he was definitely headed for prison. Why? Well, he was president of Israel for a while, and then he wasn't. And then he was president again. I think starting in 2022, he was reelected again. But there was a 2.5, maybe 3-year period there where he wasn't. And he was involved, as well as his wife, in several questionable deals and behavior that was enough for an indictment from I guess the Israeli equivalent of a grand jury, to bring serious charges against Bibi and his wife that would throw them in jail probably for the rest of their life. So the assertion has been, because of the depth of these crimes, Bibi started this war. Yeah, I know what the general story is, that it was the Hamas soldiers who started it over the wall and into Israel. Whatever. Regardless of who started it, going to war full scale as Israel has against Hamas has put the prime minister out of touch of the Israeli courts. Now, if that's only half true, and if you read Haaretz, if you read the Times of Israel, if you read the Jerusalem Post, the press agents, the news writers, the journalists of these Israeli newspapers are not very friendly to Mr. Netanyahu. And they're calling him out on his fraud and his crimes. Now, he hasn't been to court yet. And that's what's been forestalled because of the war. Now, with that setting, comes President Trump. And President Trump is saying, this is what he's saying. It was the United States of America that saved Israel. And now it's going to be the United States of America that saves Bibi Netanyahu. Then in caps on X, this travesty of justice cannot be allowed. And then after a lot of embarrassing braggadocio, he said, Bibi and I just went through hell together, fighting a very tough and brilliant longtime enemy of Israel, Iran. And Bibi could not have been better, sharper, or stronger in his love for the incredible Holy Land. I don't know if I can read this. About the glories of the U.S. unprovoked bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities, Trump insisted again. Bibi Netanyahu's trial should be canceled immediately, or a pardon given to a great hero who's done so much for the state. So Bibi, of course, was exultantly pleased. He thanked Trump, promised lasting cooperation, posting Trump's full stuff, and then requested a 2-week hiatus in his testimony in his currently ongoing trial, because as his defense attorney, Amit Haddad, argued, he has to devote himself to diplomatic, national, and security issues of the first order in the wake of the recent war with Iran. Now, one thing I didn't mention was that the court decided to go ahead with the prosecution of Bibi Netanyahu, even though there's some loopholes there for him to avoid prosecution because of the war situation and his position as prime minister. But the courts said, we've waited long enough, we're going to go after him. Now his attorney is saying, oh, please back off. You're getting Bibi upset. He's trying to save Israel. He's the hero of Israel. So the Times of Israel recently published a retort titled Experts Lambast President Trump's Call to End the Prime Minister's Trial as Assault on Judicial Independence. And this is what the Israeli newspaper said. Several of Netanyahu's supporters also worried that it looks bad for the U.S. president to so openly order how Israeli internal affairs are to be settled. You think? Knesset member Simcha Rothman, whom Israel's Haaretz daily identified as the architect of Netanyahu's attempt to strip the judiciary of its independence, felt it necessary to be heard saying that it is not the role of the U.S. president to interfere in legal proceedings in the state of Israel. The independence of Israel and its judicial system must be preserved. Well, I've got some notes here. Trump is no longer interested in a nuclear deal with Iran. I'm going to pass on that. All right, let me move on to some more stuff. Now, this really got my attention. Not that any of the rest of this was unworthy of my attention. The Telegraph's, the publication, The Telegraph, their resident imperial madman, Hamish de Breton Gordon, made clear a couple of days ago who the real target of the U.S. bunker busters dropped on Iran really was. Now, this is a publication, a major publication in Britain. It came out the day after those 6 huge, gigantic 15-ton bombs were dropped on Iran. He said this, who the real target of these bombs were. Operation Midnight Hammer, an incredible demonstration of U.S. military power, and Israeli operations before it, have made plain the fragility of the Russian air defense system. So he wrote in another column entitled, Putin will be quaking in his boots today. Iran-Israel has shown he is vulnerable. These events will be shaking the very foundations of the Russian military. So Debreton Gordon's call for open war against Russia probably should not be dismissed completely as the ravings of a madman. I mean, he is that. But he's also the officer of the Order of the British Empire, which, as a retired British Army colonel and former commander of UK and NATO chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear forces, he has a long record of telling dodgy stories that nonetheless serve as an imperial purpose. In 2023, he claimed that Russian President Putin was preparing to use the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant as an improvised nuclear weapon. Then in the 2016 to 2018 period, he played a very important role in fomenting the chemical weapons hoax in Syria, which was used, among other things, to induce Trump to order airstrikes against Syria. Now he says in the Telegraph this last weekend, or a few days before that, the Russian dictator and his advisors must now have realized that their defenses could easily be suppressed if the Ukrainians or another opponent such as NATO had the right tools. The comprehensive U.S. and Israeli intelligence networks that we have seen in Iran, which even allow them to pinpoint and assassinate key leaders and nuclear scientists almost at will have terrified the Kremlin hierarchy, the more so as Ukraine appears to have similar reach inside Russia. Operation Spider's Web, in which Russia's strategic air fleet was decimated several times over, stands testament to their effectiveness. I can't read that without laughing. Therefore, he claims, it is now even clear that America has total overmatch over against Russia's forces, and if Trump chooses to, he could inflict total battlefield defeat on Putin, or eliminate him personally by equipping Ukraine with the same weapons that Israel has. Hopefully by now, Trump is buoyed by his success in Iran, this demonstration of superior military power to the Kremlin, backed by some suitably robust messaging, will convince Putin to come to the negotiation table. If Trump achieves this, he may well get the Nobel Peace Prize he so covets, and he would deserve it. And the madness goes on. The absolute madness goes on. Putin must be shaking in his boots. Now, let's put this in context. How many anti-aircraft missiles did Iran launch against those B-2 bombers? That with the Russian air defense system that they have, or the Russian air defense system that they have left, could have taken down at least a couple of those, if not more. Not one. There's no record anywhere, no satellite images, no ground video, nothing of any air defense attack against those jets, all 6 of them. High altitude, fast moving, very difficult to detect stealth. When they're up that high, as they were when they were doing their job, they're not as stealthy as they are close to the ground. And it's interesting, I was reading a report on those B-2 bombers. The high speeds at which they fly has a way of slowly degrading materials, chemicals on the surface of the wings that help to deflect radar or help them to be unseen by radar. Those things have to be that the planes have to be completely cleaned and rebaptized in that fluid material after a flight like this. Thought that was kind of interesting. Now, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced that Britain is going to buy a dozen F-35A nuclear-capable stealth fighters from the U.S. and join NATO's nuclear sharing program. See, nobody's talking this stuff down. Nobody's backing away or slowing down this rhetoric. It's just getting closer and closer to a nuclear showdown. He says the new fast jets will be based at RAF Marham, where the government expected to procure 138 F-35s over the lifetime of the program. He says the purchase represents the biggest strengthening of the UK's nuclear posture in a generation. It also reintroduces a nuclear role for the Royal Air Force for the first time since the UK retired to sovereign air-launched nuclear weapons following the end of the Cold War. Now, the statement, of course, makes no mention of the dubious role that the United States is playing in this plan. RAF Markham is about 25 kilometers north of RAF Lakenheath, where the U.S. Air Force has recently upgraded the existing nuclear storage bunkers and likewise made preparations for the return of the B-61 nuclear bombs to that location. And the statement provides no details of the arrangements that'll have to be made or to their timing. So the statement quotes Starmer as saying, the UK's commitment to NATO is unquestionable, as is the alliance's contribution to keeping the UK safe and secure. But we must step up to the project that the Euro area has generations to come. Now we're going to be going to break here in a moment with K-Talk Radio when the top of the news starts. And I think I am going to, oh shoot, how do I do that? I was going to introduce a break as well on, it's got to be in there. And a break as well on the oh, there it is. I think that's it. A break as well on the stream. So those who are listening on the stream can take a break as well as I can, because it's very difficult to be so bellicose over 2 hours as I have been. So I've got an awful lot more for you as to how this war, the Israeli-Iranian war, is not over by any means. It's just trying to slow down long enough to catch its breath. So I am looking for the radio station to go to break, which it should have done by now. And then, I'm sorry to sound mealy-mouthed at the moment. You know, the Defense Intelligence Agency, one of our very important intelligence assessment, is saying that the attack on the three nuclear sites in Iran did not destroy the core components of the Iranian nuclear program. It was only likely to set it back a few months. Now, I haven't heard Tulsi's name here. I haven't heard the Secretary of, the DNI, a cabinet position, mind you. And what I've failed to see is anything that she's had to say in the minimum. Now, when the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is under her, comes out and says the core components of Iranian's nuclear development was not destroyed after the president said it was the most strategic destruction in military history, The analysis of the damage to the sites and the impact of the strikes on Iran's nuclear ambitions, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency, is ongoing and could change even for a worse picture if as more intelligence becomes available. But CNN says the early findings are at odds with Trump's reported claims that the strikes completely and totally obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. And then, of course, Pete Hegseth comes out and says that the nuclear ambitions of Iran have been completely obliterated. And two of the people familiar with the assessment said Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium was not.
The Department of Labor and the Department of Health and Human Services pending further proceedings in the case. It marks a defeat to the labor unions that have sued.
Sorry about that. Well, it looks like some kind of a break is playing. Let me see what I can do here.
We found GetCCL.com. GetCCL.com gave us the help we need to apply for a legal concealed carry permit that's recognized in over half of the country. GetCCL.com simplifies the process to apply, and it's all online. We use their free software to answer a few questions and
All right, maybe we're back. Maybe we're back in business. That was very uncoordinated, and I'm sorry if it looked a little unprofessional, but I am trying to, I'm trying to ride two horses here, and it's not easy to do. I want to get back to this DIA assessment because two of the people that are familiar with that assessment said Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium was not destroyed. And one of the people said that the centrifuges were largely intact. Why would they largely be intact? Because they weren't there. Either they were deep enough in the mountain that even this massive bombing couldn't stop it, or, as is indicated in many press outlets, they were told a few days ahead of the time that this was coming, and they managed to get their stuff out of there. And that most of this was for show, of course. Another source said that the intelligence assessed enriched uranium was moved out of the sites several days. So, and I'm quoting, the DIA assessment is that the U.S. set them back maybe a few months. So not surprisingly, when this happened, when this report came out, the White House went nuts over the CNN story, which was widely covered in media on both sides of the Atlantic. The White House said this alleged assessment is flat out wrong and was classified as top secret, but was still leaked to CNN by an anonymous low-level loser in the intelligence community. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said in a statement, the leaking of this alleged assessment is a clear attempt to demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted a perfectly executed mission to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Everyone knows that what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their target. Total obliteration. Then Trump put this out on Truth Social. Fake news CNN, together with the failing New York Times, have teamed up in an attempt to demean one of the most successful military strikes in history. The nuclear sites in Iran are completely destroyed. Both the Times and CNN are getting slammed by the public. So CNN sources said that these MOPs, massive ordnance penetrator bombs, MOPs, did not fully eliminate the Fordow and Natanz sites, nor the centrifuges or highly enriched uranium. Instead, the impact to all three sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, was largely restricted to above-ground structures, which were severely damaged. That includes the site's power infrastructure and some of the above-ground facilities used to turn uranium into metal for potential bomb making. Just amazing. Now, I had something here from Putin. Oh yeah, in a June 23rd speech at the Kremlin to a meeting with distinguished graduates of the Russian military and security institutions, Putin told them, he said, today's Russian soldiers are the direct heirs of the heroes of the Great Patriotic War and all those who have defended our 1,000-year-old Russia across generations. He said, we are going to focus in particular on the nuclear triad. The strategic missile forces will be equipped with the latest YARS systems, and the aviation component of the strategic nuclear forces will be reinforced with upgraded Tu-160 missile carriers this year. In addition, he said, serial production of the state-of-the-art medium-range missile system, Orishnik, is underway. It has demonstrated outstanding performance in combat situations. So the mass production of that Orishnik, which is more devastating than these MOPs, these massive ordnance penetrator bombs. is now underway in mass production. Now, in all honesty, I'm not sure why Iran agreed to the ceasefire, unless, of course, they were getting pushed by Russia to break it off. Now, why would Russia, if I'm right, why would Russia want to break off the attack on Israel, the Iranian attack? I think I talked about this last week. There are 2 million Russian-speaking residents of Israel that went there from Russia, Jews or otherwise. 2 million of them, former Russian citizens or dual citizens with Russia and Israel, that speak Russian. I also think it was Russia that told Iran, do not shoot down those B-2 bombers. Let them do what they're going to do. They're going to do some damage. We know that. But the important aspects of Iran's nuclear development has been removed from those 3 sites, so don't worry about it. Let them do what they're going to do, but stop the missiles into Israel, please. You're killing ethnic Russians that live in Israel. Now, the Iranian leaders, if that's true, have got to be seen somewhat in a naive light. Some apparently believe that they can achieve a legitimate negotiated deal with Donald Trump. Certainly by now, Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander has read Donald Trump's vomit, I don't know what else to call it, on Bibi Netanyahu. And despite Trump's temper tantrum last Monday, when he dropped the F-bomb, complaining about the ignorance of Iran and Israel, he still has his lips firmly planted on Bibi's backside, and he's going, I think, to look for a pretext to continue the war with Iran. Now, while there is no doubt that Israel inflicted some serious damage on Iran by killing scores of military leaders and nuclear scientists, Iran has hit Israel far harder, which the popular news media is not picking up. Israel has one international airport, Ben Gurion. Just one international airport, Ben Gurion. Do you know how many international airports Iran has? 29. And by closing Ben Gurion, Iran cut off Israel's access to commercial air traffic. Israel hit at least 3 airports in Iran, but did not stop commercial air traffic to Iran. I know that because I have the programs that watch the airplanes in the sky. And I go over there every day, on my computer, and look at air traffic in that area. There's nothing over Israel, nothing. Iran still has plenty. How about the seaports? Israel only has 2 ports that can handle container ships, Haifa and Ashdod. Iran forced the closure of Haifa and was on its way to closing Ashdod when they suddenly decided to agree to the ceasefire. Do you know what would happen to Israel if no container ships could dock at Israel and their international airport was closed because of bomb damage? And keep in mind Iran is still holding back on their most powerful missiles. Iran forced the closure of Haifa, and then Iran, by contrast, has 8 principal ports on the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. 8 container ship ports. None of these were forced to suspend operations. Now, if Iran had shut down Ashdod, Israel would have faced the prospect of significant shortages of essential items, not the least of which would have been food and energy. Israel would have been compelled to rely on military airports for resupply, but it appears that a lot of the military airports, and there are several of them in Israel, have been hit by Iranian missiles and suffered some damage. The extent, we don't know, thanks to the efficiency of Israelis' news censors. Iran also hurt Israel's ability to refine oil at the Haifa refinery, located in Haifa Bay, with a capacity of about 197,000 barrels a day. Iran reportedly hit and severely damaged the Haifa refinery. Israel has one other refinery at Ashdod, with a capacity of 108,000 barrels a day. I haven't seen any reports yet that talk about the refinery at Ashdod. Had this war continued, had President Trump not told Bibi stop, I think that's what happened, Israel likely would have faced an unprecedented economic crisis if it lost its 2 main container ports and its refineries. Because Israel's air defense system has been rendered inoperable. There is no Iron Dome anymore, it's an iron sieve. And Iran continues to demonstrate the ability to hit critical infrastructure. Israel could have faced, as I was saying earlier last hour, had this war continued, a total existential crisis that this week, had it continued, would have been the end of Israel. So the director of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, is in a panic. During an interview with a French TV station, he said, "The IAEA has lost the ability to monitor Iran's enriched uranium stockpile following the recent escalation between Israel and Iran." Now, I think Iranian officials probably now realize they were played for fools by the IAEA, because circumstantial evidence points to the IAEA as the source that provided the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the Iranian nuclear scientists that were murdered by the Israeli operatives. And Iran is taking steps to end this relationship with the IAEA, according to Eureka News. Quote, "The Iranian parliament approved a bill on Wednesday to suspend cooperation with the IAEA. Alireza Salimi, a member of the Iranian parliament's presidency, stated that the decision would be referred to the Supreme National Security Council for approval. He also said that the agency inspectors would be banned from entering the country and that sanctions would be imposed on those who allowed them in. The International Atomic Energy Agency did not even formally condemn the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, so it has lost its international credibility," said Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Speaker of the Parliament. He also stressed that the country intends to continue working on peaceful nuclear energy. Iran will be more ready and prepared than ever. Our hand is on the trigger. We will respond with overwhelming force to any aggression. Now, the fact that they could take out Ashdod with 2 or 3 missile strikes as soon as the ceasefire stops could be the beginning of Israel's existential crisis. Now, Grossi, the director of the IAEA, is throwing his own version of a temper tantrum. He said this: "Iran has an obligation to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency on its nuclear program. It's not a favor, it's a legal obligation as long as Iran remains a signatory to the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty." Well, in light of the events in the last almost 2 weeks, Iran would be entirely justified to withdraw from the NPT. And I wonder if Russia and China are reconsidering their cooperation with the IAEA. I mean, how could you trust them from this point on? It's like trusting America's foreign policy makers. Russia's Sergei Lavrov made the same observation as Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, harshly criticizing the IAEA's failure to denounce the Israeli and U.S. attacks on Iran's nuclear plants. Now, where's President Trump this Monday morning, the last day of June? Probably completely confident that Iran is going to return to the negotiating table. I heard that joke, I think it was Larry Johnson, that if Iran sits down with Stephen Witkoff and agrees to halt all uranium enrichment, because that's what Witkoff is going to want as a continuation of the ceasefire, you stop all nuclear development, then the joke was that Iran, whoever represented them at this meeting, would say, what nuclear development? You destroyed it all. And given the perfidy of the IAEA and the unlawful actions of Israel and the United States, Iranian officials would be fools to entertain any kind of a talk like that. But we'll see here in the days ahead just how far crazy things can get. Because I don't think that war's over with by any means. But Israel knows, and the citizens, the Israeli citizens who are escaping Israel, they're getting on these small boats headed for Cyprus. Because they're not going to go to Egypt. They're not going to go to Lebanon or Syria. The closest place that would accept them temporarily would be Cyprus. And so here, how long ago was it that these flotillas were coming from Cyprus to Israel to feed the starving Gazans? And now Israel is loading up boats to Cyprus to escape the killing of Israeli citizens by Iranian missiles. That's not irony, is it? I think it's more comeuppance. I don't want to see these people killed. I don't want to see innocent people killed. All right. Now, the most entertaining thing that I have seen on TV or on the internet this last week was the interview between Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson. If you didn't see it, you got to see it. I mean, it was something else. And in fairness to Cruz, Carlson was poking and prodding and was quite annoying in the way he was trying to get Cruz to come around to say what Carlson wanted him to say. But until Cruz embarrassed himself with his two-bit dispensationalist, I think they're calling it, heresy, I don't think he was being overly unreasonable, and I agreed with some of his sentiments. I did. There were some things Cruz said I agreed with. But when Cruz had to drop into Genesis 12, then I had a problem. So Carlson and Cruz spoke largely about the Iran-Israel situation as it currently stands in the state of flux that it is. I'm certainly not an expert on it. But what may be the outcome could change at any moment. Due to the subject matter, they discuss the notion of whether a nation, in this case the United States, should be purely isolationist regarding global conflicts, or whether there's room for joining in the conflicts involving other nations. Now, I agreed with something Cruz said, that in the modern day world, pure isolationism may not be the best ideal, especially when missiles can cross both oceans. But there can be instances where allies do have each other's backs, which is to say nothing about Israel per se, only that I agree with the concept that you might have a relationship with another country where you're watching each other's back. In any event, Carlson's poking and prodding was not senseless or just for dramatic effect, and eventually the interview reached this crescendo where Cruz exposed himself for his dispensationalist views, which he said explicitly animates his insistence that the state of Israel must be protected at all costs. Without even being asked the question directly, Cruz insisted on telling Carlson why he vowed to be a staunch defender of Israel. He said, "Growing up in Sunday school, I was taught from the Bible, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And I want to be on the blessing side of things." All right, here we go. I wasn't sure if I wanted to get into this. If you are or have been raised Christian in a church setting, not just your parents were Christian and so you kind of think of yourself as being Christian, but you're not involved in church or church groups or study groups or Bible groups or anything else. But even if that's the case, Catholic, Protestant, Latter-day Saint, Jehovah's Witness, whatever else, if you even understand a small portion of Christian belief, you'll know that most of the Old Testament, those sacrifices and the things that they were pointing to, ceased and were satisfied with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, which is renewed every time you take the sacrament or the communion or the what's the other word? Doesn't matter. Because the Old Testament Israelites, who were chosen by God to be the people from whom Christ would be born through, and that Christ would open the gates of heaven with his sacrifice so that all men can be saved. And his last injunction after his 40-day ministry was to take this message to all nations. Now, this is basic Christology and the salvific work of Christ on the cross. And it shouldn't be all that controversial. Now, in the fairness to the dispensationalists, and I know a couple, it's true that when you peruse through the majority of the work of the Christian fathers over the centuries, and numerous great theologians, you'll find an insistence that the Jews will be integral to the second coming of Christ. For many reasons, but not for the happy and fun reasons as so many dispensationalists think. According to the majority view of the dispensationalist fathers and others, the Antichrist will be ethnically Jewish in some way, and he will convince the world that he is the Messiah. And he will somehow enthrone himself in the temple, which is to be built yet, which will have to be in existence before he can enthrone himself in the temple, and recommence the Old Testament sacrifices. And that's the story about the red heifer and all the stuff that certain millennialists and dispensationalists are doing their best right now to orchestrate, despite the falling Iranian missiles. Now, this will take place along with the great apostasy that's coming, as these Christian fathers have taught, during which most Christians will likely have renounced their faith, having been caught up in the international zeitgeist that views the Antichrist as the real Christ. It's not going to be a fun time, according to the prophecies, but most dispensationalists believe that there will be this pre-millennial period where Christ will return before a literal 1,000-year reign on earth, where he will establish the physical kingdom of God on the earth. Along with this, there precedes this is the rapture, which many Christians argue whether it has any efficacy or not. The rapture is not mentioned as such in the New Testament, but it's held by many dispensationalist and ecumenical groups who believe the righteous are going to be taken away from the earth before things get really bad. Now, some adherents believe that the rapture is going to happen before the tribulation. And some believe it'll be in the middle of the tribulation, and some believe it will be after the tribulation. In addition, they believe there's going to be a restored Israel, like Israel in the Bible, and this is where Cruz's insistence on supporting Israel comes into play. Now, ultimately, those who hold these views believe it's a matter of salvation, or at least a matter of biblical history, that the nation of Israel itself should be restored to its Old Testament glory, and that this is a good thing that God himself has foretold in the Bible through his prophets. Unfortunately, this belief is held by so many influential politicians like Cruz that it animates the foreign policy of our federal government when it comes to Israel. And they literally believe that by supporting the modern state of Israel, the genocidal Israel that has killed over 60,000 innocent women, children, and elderly in the Gaza through shooting, starvation, crushing, bombing, burning, that they literally believe that by supporting this modern state of Israel, they're doing God's will and they're going to be rewarded for it, either by being raptured before things get bad, or in some other temporal way where they will be blessed because they blessed Israel. Personally, I believe these people are insane, and it's heretical. And no one should take it seriously because it is a modern, novel belief that does not correspond to historical biblical exegesis. In Catholicism or historical mainline Protestantism, nevertheless, for those for some other reason adore the modern state of Israel, are more than happy to promote and tolerate this heresy because it's good for business. It's good for re-election campaign donations. It's good for being a friend of AIPAC. What is so tragically ironic about the whole thing that is, in some sense, these crazies, these dispensationalists may be a part of the events that bring about the second coming. But they are paving the way for the Antichrist, if you believe in such a thing. That he's just around the corner. And the more you hear John Hagee, the more you hear some of these other Christian characters who go over to Israel and march arm in arm with their Jewish brothers and sisters, who believe that they're paving the way for the second coming of Jesus, which, wouldn't ever happen without their efforts to bring this thing to pass. Jesus will just be sitting around bored to death waiting for his second coming until these Christian dispensationalists can get the job done. I realize that may offend some of you, but I can't honestly just kind of sit back and not say something like this. Because I've had some conversations with some of these people, and you know what it does? It reminds me of Nazi Germany and the kind of arguments that were used in the persecution of the Jews that allowed Kristallnacht and several other programs leading up to the Warsaw Ghetto slaughter and everything from there, in the name of the Third Reich. And so when they talk about more people have been killed in the name of God in the history of the planet than anything else, that's a very unfair thing to say for God. More people have been killed by the will of the international banking systems and the need for the banks to hold on to their control than anything else. I'll agree to that. But this is why Christopher Atkins wrote that wonderful book, God is Not Great. Because he goes through the three basic religions, the Jewish, the Hebrew faith, the Islamic faith, and the Christian faith, showing their history of what happens to their opponents once they get in control. If you haven't read it, whether you believe God is great or not, it's a very good book for history. All right, now, a couple more things. I have to say something about this election that just took place in New York. I usually don't talk too much about domestic things, but this to me is as eye-opening in the sense of New York or New York City as Trump's overwhelming election last November was for the whole country of the United States. So you have this young left-wing candidate, Zoran Mamdani, is absolutely posed to become the Democratic nominee for the New York mayor after delivering this stunning political upset. He's a 33-year-old Democratic socialist who defeated his main rival and political veteran, Andrew Cuomo, who had previously served as the state governor. And he said this the other night here. He says, "Tonight we made history." And he says, if elected, he will become the first Muslim Indian American to lead a nation's largest city. The first Muslim Indian American to lead the nation's largest city. So Cuomo, 67 years old, was attempting to pull off a comeback after resigning from his office in 2021 over that sexual harassment scandal. And he congratulated his opponent as a really smart and great campaign. So the primary in staunchly liberal New York City is likely to determine who becomes mayor in November's election. So the contest was being watched as a litmus test for the Democratic Party as it's trying to hone its message after these terrible election losses last November that saw, Trump and MAGA and the Republicans take over both houses of Congress, both chambers. So results in this Tuesday night vote last week showed that Mamdani, with a commanding lead, but fell short of the 50% threshold needed to win outright. Cuomo's concession was unexpected because counting looks likely to continue next week under the ranked choice system, which allows New Yorkers to pick up 5 candidates in order of preference, something they've tried to get here in Utah a number of times, where you have a ranked choice. So there's 5 candidates running for governor in Utah, and you pick them in order as to who you want. And then that's tallied at the end as whoever, it comes out at the end as what represents the best tally that the people can put together, rather than a straight vote. So the former governor's loss, a political strategist at the BBC said, marks the biggest upset in modern New York City history. A massive win for Zoran Mamdani shows that when Donald Trump is president, New York Democrats want to see their leaders fight with enthusiasm and courage, and that's what Zoran has shown the voters. So in an interview with the New York Times, Cuomo said he's still examining whether he's going to run in the general election in November on the independent line, because Mamdani didn't get a mandate vote. He said, I won the primary election, Cuomo. I said I wanted to look at the numbers and the ranked choice voting to decide what to do in the future, because I'm also on the independent line. So he was seen as a moderate, an establishment favorite, known across the country for his governorship during the COVID pandemic. Mamdani is a millennial outsider who was fairly unknown until recently. He was born in Uganda. His family moved to New York City when he was 7. He's posted one campaign video entirely in Urdu and mixed in Bollywood film clips. In another, he speaks Spanish. And Mamdani's strong support of Palestinians and criticism of Israel has put him at odds with most of his Democratic establishment. So he went viral during his campaign for videos where he talked to New Yorkers who swung for Trump in the November election. And he asked what issues led them to cast their ballots for the Republican candidate and what it would take for them to swing Democrat. So Mamdani's platform that got a lot of attention includes free public buses, universal child care, freezing rent in subsidized units, and city-run grocery stores, all paid for by new taxes on the rich. He said, this is a city where 1 in 4 of its people are living in poverty. Boink. And a city where 500,000 kids go to sleep hungry every night. And ultimately, it's a city that's in danger of losing that which makes it so special. So Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders endorsing Mamdani during his campaign. This guy might get in there, which is an interesting possibility at this point. All right, now some information I just got. The U.S. military strikes on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities last weekend, as we've been talking about, certainly did not destroy the core components of the country's nuclear program and likely only set it back a few months. The assessment here, which has now been previously reported, was produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's intelligence arm. It is based on a battle damage assessment conducted by U.S. Central Command in the aftermath of the U.S. strikes. The analysis of the damage to the sites and the impact of, I'm reading from the reporter, impact of the strikes on Iran's nuclear ambitions is ongoing and could change as more intelligence becomes available. But the early findings are at odds with President Donald Trump's repeated claims that the strikes completely and totally obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. And then Defense Secretary Hegseth said on Sunday, on the Sunday talk shows, that Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated. Now here's the problem. The flip-flopping of the president. I don't know what they're going to do. I know exactly what they're going to do. I don't know where their stuff is. I know exactly where their stuff is. Well, I think his presidency has suffered a big blow because of this. They were simply caught in a lie. Now, the analysis of the damage to the sites and the impact of the strikes on Iran's nuclear ambitions is ongoing and could change as more intelligence comes, as I said. But two of the people familiar with the assessment of Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium that was not destroyed, one of the people said the centrifuges are largely intact. Now, there's stories that say they took the centrifuges out. There's stories that say the really important centrifuges are deep enough that those impacts could not hurt them. And there's other stories that say, well, if there were any centrifuges destroyed, they were the primitive, earlier model, easy ones to destroy centrifuges, as opposed to sturdier ones that are out there now. Now, you know what a centrifuge is. You know what cascades are. Or if you don't, maybe I can briefly. A centrifuge is just a spinning, you know, if you were in a blood lab and they were trying to ascertain various aspects of the blood or separate some of the blood, some of the components of the blood are heavier than other components. So they put them in the test tubes and they put them in these devices, flip them out like this, and spin them at a high RPM. And that makes sure that the heavier elements of the blood sample get to the end of the test tube. So when they take them out, there's striations of the tube. And down at the bottom would be the heaviest material. And then they, using pipettes, can take out different samples at different levels of that tube for further study to determine the components of the blood. So when you put this uranium material, and interestingly enough, I was reading in one report where uranium ore is more radioactive than the concentrated metallic uranium. Because after the concentration process in a centrifuge, where you're beginning to turn, or you're concentrating the material into a more concentrated form, it begins to become metallic, of course. I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, the devices that do that, according to several investigative intelligence groups, say they weren't hurt. They're there. They're operating now. So this is what Caroline Leavitt said the other day. This alleged assessment is flat out wrong, that they weren't hurt. It was classified as top secret, but still leaked to CNN by an anonymous low-level loser in the intelligence community. The leaking of this alleged assessment is a clear attempt to demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted a perfectly executed mission to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Everyone knows what happens when you drop 14, 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their targets. Total obliteration. That's if they went down those holes, because there's reports coming out now that say that didn't happen. They exploded on the surface. Now, Trump, who is in, let's say, I suppose he's back in Washington, who was at the UN summit or the NATO summit, excuse me, pushed back on a CNN report on his Truth Social post, saying one of the most successful military strikes in history, the nuclear sites in Iran are completely destroyed. Then Hegseth, who was also at the NATO summit, said last Wednesday the assessment was a top secret report. It was preliminary, it was low confidence. He said the U.S. military has said the operation went as planned and that it was an overwhelming success. So it's still kind of early. For the United States to have a comprehensive picture of the impact of the strikes, none of the sources described how the DIA assessment compares to the view of other agencies, because we haven't heard much from the others. And where is Tulsi Gabbard? It looks like she's sold out, I hate to say. But Iran has a well-developed nuclear program. Iran has been developing its nuclear infrastructure since the 1960s, often in secret with some facilities buried underground, but it's capable of most stages of uranium production from mining to enrichment, and it insists, of course, to this day that its development is peaceful. But who knows after this attack, whether or not that they may go straight to the bomb. Now, the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, built in secret, buried deep underground, Fordow uses 2,200 centrifuges to produce uranium enriched up to 60%. The Natanz enrichment complex, Iran's largest uranium enrichment site, contains 14,000 centrifuges located deep underground, capable of enriching to 60%. The Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center hosts multiple facilities that convert yellow cake to uranium hexafluoride and to produce nuclear fuel and make uranium metal for nuclear weapons. And the Bushehr, that you don't hear too much about, nuclear power plant, Iran's only operating nuclear power plant, generating electricity using Russian-supplied fuel. So Israel has been carrying out strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities for days leading up to the U.S. attack, but claimed to need the U.S. 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs in order to finish the job that the Israelis had started. And while the U.S. B-2 bombers dropped over a dozen of these bombs, I think 14, on 2 of the nuclear facilities, Fordow and Natanz, the bombs did not fully eliminate the site's centrifuges and highly enriched uranium, according to people familiar with the assessment. Now, we've only seen what the Defense Intelligence Agency has had to say, that it wasn't a complete destruction, and that the President and Hegseth are on a different path than the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, instead, the impact to